Thank you for joining us for this episode. Today we're joined by Dr. Ben Chudner, and we're going to be speaking about misperceptions in private equity on the OI show. Thanks again for joining us for the OI show. Today, as I mentioned, we're joined by Dr. Ben Chudner. Ben, it is good to have you on the show. How are you doing today, my man?
I'm doing great, Dave. It's good to see you. It's been a long time.
It has. Ben and I served for the Optometric Physicians of Washington back in like 2009, 2010, somewhere in that neighborhood. And we've seen each other, but haven't had very many long conversations. So it's good to hang out again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I had asked Ben to come on, and Ben has ventured in the optometric profession in many different ways. You were selling your practice back in the aughts days, and then you've gone to do some other things. Why don't you walk us through a short version of your career and the many things you've done in the short period of time?
Yeah. So when we met, I was in private practice. I had owned that practice ultimately for about 10 years. I bought it in August of 2001, not far from where you are in Washington State, and then ended up selling it in February of 2011. And I went on to go internal with Bausch& Lomb. As you know, I was consulting quite a bit for B&L at the time. They asked me to come inside. I took over management of learning and development for them. So I trained a lot of their reps and then helped develop a lot of the content for new launches. Did that for a couple of years. And then, of course, there was the turmoil with the acquisition from when they went from private to Warburg, or from Warburg Pincus to Valiant. And then I was director of professional strategy, and that lasted for about a year and a half. Recruited away, went to go work for Luxottica under the LensCrafters banner as a senior eye care director, where I oversaw eye care operations for about 180 locations at all of Canada, east to west. So I went all the way to Vancouver Island in the west, then to Toronto in the east. Also had what we called the Great Lakes, which kind of had Michigan, Ohio, a little bit of Kentucky. Then was promoted from there to senior clinical director for Luxottica, overseeing optometric engagement for about 2,400 locations in North America. So I had all the brands, so Pearl, Sears, Target at the time, LensCrafters, and Macy's, and did that for a little while. And then I got an opportunity. I was recruited away to be, at that time, what was VP of eye care for AEG Vision. At that time, actually, it was Acuity Eye Care Group. And then that was in July of 18. So it's been a little over 4 years. And then in September of 2020, after we got through COVID, I was promoted to chief medical officer, which was a position that didn't exist. And they saw the need to elevate optometry in the organization. So now I stand as the chief medical officer for AEG Vision. I oversee all clinical operations for, I think we have 300, and it changes daily, as you can imagine, but 304 locations throughout 16 states. Almost 600 doctors. So
Yeah.
it's
Wow.
been a wild ride.
It has been. And when you started optometry school your first year, you probably had no idea that you were going to go outside of the exam lane and not fit contact lenses and glasses on people, right? Look at this
Yeah,
career, right?
it's been crazy. I mean, when I went to optometry school, I was in and out of eye doctors since I was 5. I ended up, before LASIK in '97, I was a 950, and so I just assumed that I'd graduate from optometry school and do that for private practice for 30 years and retire like my doctor had done, and then life just takes you in different directions.
Hmm. Well, I oftentimes think about how impactful we are in our profession, and some of us are destined to be impactful to the patient that we're sitting across from. Some of us are impactful in the way that we support doctors from an industry perspective, and then some of people are there to support us in from an industry perspective to make our practices better. And you've kind of ventured through all of those different aspects, and always with the patient in mind. How do we make people's lives better? And it's an incredible thing, and that's why we went to optometry school. We thought it was to flip dials, but it was really to make people and patients better, right?
Exactly. And that was actually the hardest decision. You wouldn't think it was. I mean, I was lecturing quite a bit for Bausch. I think you and I followed each other quite a bit. You were with a different company, but and I slowly started to realize I wanted to do something different. But when they offered me the position, I think the hardest part was deciding to leave the lane. I remember talking to my wife about it and saying, I've always identified, at least in my adult life, as an optometrist, or at least my adult professional life. And am I still an optometrist if I'm not in the lane, seeing
Yeah.
patients? And a friend of mine finally looked at me and said, "You're being an idiot, right? If it doesn't work out, you're always an optometrist. You can go back to the lane." And that was enough to make the switch. But as I went through my different roles, I did exactly that. I looked at what my impact is going to be, right? And so, I got to a place where my practice was doing quite nice. I think we saw, I don't know, maybe it was 4 to 5,000 patients a year. So, I had direct impact on that. When I got to Luxottica, we were seeing 5 million patients a year.
Hmm.
The things that we did to help support the doctors there, I had a direct impact on patient care. So it was different. It wasn't me directly, but by being in that role and taking that position, that's, you start to think through, what is my legacy, if you will. And we had a lot of impact on a lot of patients, and now we're doing it a little bit differently. And I think we are changing the way optometry is viewed in the profession a little bit with private equity where I'm at now. So, but it's the same concept, right? How can I how can I create a positive influence on this machine that's moving forward to protect optometry and our patients?
Yeah. Let's hit on a couple of those. What are some of the most common misperceptions that we have about private equity? Because you're here to ruin me, right? Isn't that
Yeah.
right? So tell me about some of the misperceptions that you hear, and let's make those falsehoods
Yeah.
truthhoods, or
So
make them reality.
yeah, I think unfortunately some of the worst things we hear may be true in some organizations, right? So we certainly have heard that this is just a corporate takeover of optometry. We're going to destroy private practice, and it's going to be this big corporate entity in another Luxottica or another VisionWorks. And I think to some extent there is risk of that, and I think we certainly see that. And I'm not here to bash other organizations. We're certainly not the biggest private equity group out there, and there's some that are bigger that are very successful. But there are models out there where it's designed to completely reshape what the practice looks like and create kind of a national homogenous view of what these practices look like to the public. That's not all private equity. So while that misperception is based in some reality, the truth is there are private equity groups that take a very different approach to how they acquire practices. So there are some out there that will leave the practice completely untouched, and in some cases won't even require changes to their systems. There's no common EHR platforms or point of sale systems. Some will have common platforms, but will keep the names intact. So I can give you examples, obviously, from what we do. When we buy a practice, while we may eventually put them under a regional brand for marketing purposes, the practice name stays intact. And our goal is to keep the doctor there. We don't want our selling doctors to leave. They built the practice. And so their legacy has to remain. And so what we used to talk about is how we kind of keep their DNA intact. But really what we do is we take what's been best, worked best by the practices we purchase. And then we add our specialty, which is really back office stuff. So everything the patient sees should stay the same. And I think that's a common misperception. Unless somebody specifically tells a patient that one of our practices was purchased by us, they won't know. And that's intentional. And so there are groups out there that do that. So I think there are some that give that, that create this perception that all of private equity is out to destroy that private practice feel or that private practice mentality. The reality is what we're buying is private practices. At least that's our perception. And so in order to be successful, we have to maintain that private practice identity. And so we consider ourselves kind of a regional network of individual private practices.
Hmm.
So I think that's a little bit different. And we are not out to destroy private practices, because as private practices can continue to flourish, eventually they're going to want to be acquired, and then new ones will take their place and continue to grow, and there'll continue to be a pipeline to consolidate.
Yeah. So I think the other aspect of that is that you know, as with anything, there are goods and bads that are out there, right? And some that might fit a practice a little bit better than the other. And for people who may be considering private equity, it's kind of look at the options that are out there, look at more than one choice. Just because you know somebody who did one, you might not be the right fit for you, and look at the different options that are out there.
Yeah.
But also with that is if you own your own private practice, there's a real good chance there's a reason you've owned it your entire career. And things are going to be a little bit different. And
Yeah.
hopefully the things that a private equity can bring in to you would be helpful enough that it outweighs the fact that you're not 100% in control of everything anymore, right? So there's obviously that doctors who are super, super, super controlling probably tend to not be happy with any private equity firm. And those that are kind of willing to like, hey, yeah, I want you to make my practice better are probably open to having some changes come in and make things even better.
Yeah, so there's a wide array of doctors who sell, and it's there's a wide age range, right? So we certainly have the doctors in their late 50s, early 60s. We have some as old as early 70s. That this truly is an exit strategy. They're going to make enough money on the sale that they are not going to need to work, and they see it for what it is. I'm selling my practice. I'm giving someone else the reins. I'm gonna set myself up for retirement while I can. And for those doctors, I think it works extremely well because they know exactly what they're getting into. And quite honestly, probably no matter which private equity group they go with, it's going to work for them because that was their exit strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Then on the complete opposite end, we actually have doctors who have sold because they had to. They got into some financial trouble, over leveraged. We tend to see a lot of situations where doctors bought too much equipment and couldn't have the patient or didn't have the patient
Have the
base
cash flow for it.
to
Wow.
cash flow, right? So it's, that we see that. And in those cases, they're probably not going to be happy no matter what, because they didn't want to sell. But a lot of times they come around and realize that this is a better way of running things. And we're not leveraged the same way. And it gives them new opportunities to practice in a way they never would have. And then you have kind of the middle road where they probably weren't looking to sell. And then they got cold called by private equity and said, you can make, 6 times EBIT or whatever the number is. And they decide to sell solely for the money reasons. And they're probably the least happy. I'm not saying this necessarily from experience in our organization, just in general, what we see in the private equity space. So it is what you make it. If you go into this knowing full well that you are selling your practice, and what I tell people is that we're going to run things differently than you would. You're going to look at things and say, I would never do that. And what I will tell you is our model works because you become one of 304 locations instead of one of one or one of three. So we can do things differently, and we may not chase every dollar because there are bigger dollars to get with something else. So as long as you can understand that you are no longer going to be in charge and you're giving up the reins, I think you can be very successful. But to your point, it's the doctors that aren't willing to do that.
Yeah.
There's the controlling doctors that are willing to give up control, and then there's controlling doctors that are just not willing to give up control.
Yeah. Well, if I've learned one thing about optometry is we're happy to complain about things if we don't like them, right? And vocalize it.
We are,
So
yeah.
tell me some things that you're gonna do that's gonna be better about my practice. So if private equity was to come in and take over a practice, what are you gonna do better as one of 300 as opposed to what I'm doing? What are some examples of that, Ben?
Yeah, so I think our biggest success is really the work we do around CRM, the customer relationship management, and how we manage communication to patients and automate that. And I know there are systems out there that can do it, and I don't know that we're necessarily better than those systems on an individual level, but and our recall systems. And what we're finding now, and I don't know where everyone is, but what we're
Hmm.
hearing in the industry right now is exam numbers are down, and doctors are not doing as well in getting their patients to come back. Now that's a broad statement, and obviously some doctors are doing very, very well. But what we've noticed is the practices that have been in our system for at least a year have almost double-digit comps and growth. And so I would say that that's probably the biggest improvement that we make that the doctor will see is increase in patient flow. And you can imagine we can advertise. So, for example, in the state of uh, let's take Arizona, right? So we can advertise under eye care specialties of Arizona, and underneath that could be 12 individual practices that don't have to advertise individually. So if you Google search eye care specialties of Arizona, all of those practices will come up. If you Google eye exam, we're going to usually be close to the top. And then the individual practices will show up. So I think that the way we've kind of structured our marketing and our approach to patients is very beneficial. Things that doctors won't see, of course, is all the stuff on the back end, right? So not only do we increase top line revenue with increased exam growth, and then of course we have the capital to bring in new equipment. So if we want to bring in OCTs or OCT angiography, or if we want to bring in some sort of dry eye device like an IPL or LipiFlow, we have the cash to do that pretty easily. But also our margins are better, right? And I think a lot of doctors don't realize the back end improvements you can make to increase margins on things like contact lenses, for example, or even just frames and lenses. So because of that, we not only see top line growth, which the doctors will see, but we also see bottom line or EBITDA growth that doctors just won't see.
Hmm. And that's because of buying power and so forth.
Well, so there's also synergies, and probably the thing we don't like to talk about a lot is unfortunately there may be some people that will lose their job or be transplanted to another role. So a lot of times, practice will have their own biller, or we have a whole billing department. So if we can't use that biller in a practice, we will try our best to find another role for that billing person. But sometimes, unfortunately, if they're not relocatable or we don't have a position that makes sense for them, so that's a synergy that we gain. And that is
Hmm.
I mean, that's one of the things that I think I didn't understand when I was first looking at private equity and trying to, even before I was thinking of taking a role in this place was, really you buy a practice and again, let's say it's a vision source practice. I mean, they've got their costs of goods down pretty good, right? That's a great deal. Even iDoc and Perk and all these buying groups have done a fantastic job. So really, where's the leverage? Well, there's leverage in other synergies, right? So there's leverage in call centers. So we have centralized call centers, we have centralized billing, we have centralized recall, we have centralized marketing, we have centralized HR, all this stuff that a decent sized practice has to take on themselves. We've centralized it. And our goal, of course, is never to terminate people. We don't like to see people lose their jobs. So we try to incorporate them into our organization as best we can.
Hmm. Yeah, well, that makes sense. Absolutely. And it probably works better if there's multiple practices in a similar area, right? And I think that's kind of how you guys started, is you started within a couple of states and now you're expanding. Speak on that.
Yeah. So, when I joined the organization in March of 18, or excuse me, July of 18, we were just over a year old, and we were in 6 states. But most of the practices we had purchased, in fact, all the practices we purchased were multi-unit practices. So we started with 3 businesses. I think our IT business had almost 20, maybe 18 locations. Our International Eye Care Center business had almost 20. I think Crown had somewhere like 20. So it was a lot of locations. That's a lot easier. They already have structures in place where they're used to dealing with a field team. The doctors never had ownership, so they were always employees, and they were always used to kind of floating around between different offices. So that's a lot more simple. Plus, when you're looking to expand, you can build a field team. So as we expanded, so we didn't do much expansion for a long time after I first joined. Our first big expansion was in Colorado, and it was, I think, 14 or 15 locations. So when you do that, it's a new state for us. So you go in with 15 locations, and you can bring in a field team. So bring in a district manager right away who can help manage that, because you can justify that spend because you have 14 locations. Same as Nebraska was our next big one, and we already had some practices in Nebraska that were being covered by Missouri. And so now you can bring in a field team into Nebraska. So when we first enter a state, what we would like to do is do it with a larger group, 5 or 6 locations. And what we found is those are almost all gone. Most of those practices have been purchased. There's certainly some around that aren't for sale. So what we will do, or what the brokers will do, is they will get together a group of practices and form a I don't want to call it a group because they're not associated, but we buy them all at the same time. So we did that in, say, Tennessee, where there was a founders group and there were 4 or 5 practices, which represented probably 6 or 7 locations. And they all were sold together as a group, so we can bring in a field team and support them. It's very hard to go into, a state like, for us, it would be hard to go into, say, Washington, where we don't have any field team or anyone near there, and then buy one location. We'd really want to go in with 5 or 6 so we can place a field team in place.
Hmm. Yeah. Now you mentioned one other thing here, and that's this misperception that you're going to dictate how I see patients. Touch on that specifically, like you buy equipment, right? I've been a little concerned about that, right? I bought an IPL recently, and if I hadn't bought an IPL and I went into private equity, how would I go about saying, hey Ben, can I please have an IPL? Like if asking like for a Christmas present or
Right.
something.
Well, just like that, you'd ask for it just like that, and we'd make the decision. If you ask nicely, no, I think so. I think that's one thing that I will say. Every major private equity group, with the exception of the two smaller of the major groups, which is VSP and Team Vision, which is under EssilorLuxottica, have optometrists in leadership positions. I may be the only optometrist that sits on the executive team of the private equity group. But if you look at even my eye doctor, there's two ODs that are there. You look at Eye Care Partners, there's an OD there. You look at Kepler, and obviously you've got very well-known ODs there. And my feeling has always been, as long as optometrists are in those roles and they're in clinical roles to determine the direction of how the clinical strategy is going to be formulated and executed, we're going to be fine. Now, obviously, that can change, but currently that's how it is. So
Mhm.
for us, we've taken a very hands-off approach to patient care. So our philosophy is, hey, we trust our doctors. They've been doing this for a long time. The only time we get involved is if there's an adverse outcome. So if something happens where there's a patient who had an adverse outcome, then we need to get involved to understand, did we follow, are we okay? What's our liability? We need to talk to the lawyer. We need to talk to the doctor and make sure that, if there was a mistake or something was dropped, patient wasn't dilated and they should have been, then we make sure that we have the right protocols in place that we recommend to our doctors on how to manage patients. But that's really it. We trust that the doctors are going to make the right decisions to manage their patients. Until they don't, and obviously things happen, and there's some, every once in a while you'll run into a concern, and almost always it's just one of those things that happen in the course of seeing
Yeah.
patients. So we
Yeah.
take a very hands-off approach. However, one of the advantages that I always speak of with private equity is our scale. So I get asked a lot of the time from new grads, especially when they're looking to be hired, and they ask if there's an OCT in the location. And when some of our locations honestly don't have an OCT in the exact location, and they say, well, I can't practice without an OCT. And well, I graduated in 1997. I can assure you can practice without an OCT. That's not the question, right? Now, should you practice without an OCT? The answer is probably no in most cases. In fact, almost all cases. The next question is, can you afford an OCT? And if you look at the pricing of OCT right now, and you know this, right? You're talking anywhere from 40 to 60,000, and you're talking $42 on average reimbursement. It's a tough one. We've had OCTs go down in practices we purchased that over the course of a year did less than 200 scans. That's not justifiable. However, when I've got 15 practices in a location, I can certainly make sure there's an OCT available to everybody. And I can actually make sure there's an OCT angiography available to everybody. Now, it requires a different way of thinking. And IPL is a great example. So we have an IPL in Kansas as an example. We have several of them. What we allow is we've actually allowed doctors who want to get involved in dry eye management to say, hey, why don't you pick a day a month or even a day a week, however you want to do it. Maybe it's a half day. So maybe it's Monday morning. That's your IPL day. You will leave your practice. You'll go to this other location. You will manage those patients with IPL, and then you'll go back for the half day. And as you build that up, if it's a full day on Monday, if it's 2 days a week, whatever it works out to be, that's beneficial to everyone. It's good patient care. It's good revenue flow. And we can provide those opportunities without having to put in 300 IPLs. And so I think one of the things that's lost when you build this kind of scale, again, I think this has to be owned by optometrists, is we can provide opportunities for patient care that a lot of practices may not be able to do. And
Mhm.
so to that end, if you were to ask me, I may not be able to put it right there in your practice, but could I find a practice in the greater South Tacoma area where it would make sense? And then you'd have access to it. And that's what we would try to do.
Yeah. So in this case, uh, you would still allow me to make a high revenue for myself as a doctor without having to maybe buy a piece of equipment, and you're providing a large group of doctors the opportunity to see patients better. And so this is an example of how it's better for patients when you have that cost sharing that
Right.
goes into it under the umbrella of private equity, which is really bringing all those practices together.
Yeah, I mean, I remember back in the day, this will date myself, when I first bought my practice and I think 4 others or 5 others shared a GDX.
Hmm.
And it was a traveling GDX that we all had
Hmm.
one day, we had 1 week a month, or maybe it was one
Yeah.
every 5 weeks, and we just
That
scheduled
thing was
GDX
made
sessions.
to travel. It was
It was,
built to
I know,
pick up and
it
put in
totally
your
was.
car.
Yeah. It didn't do well when you travel with it, but yeah, because eventually it went down. But the point was is that none of us had enough glaucoma patients at the time to or maybe, well, that's probably not true. We probably did, but we didn't realize it. And to justify a GDX purchase at the time, but between 5 of us, you have, quite a bit more patients that can possibly benefit from a GDX. Now, of course, again, OCTs can't travel. So I take kind of a hub and spoke approach. And I look at these things now. Doctors can, for OCT as an example, I look at that as kind of like ordering labs, right? So when I go to get my physical, my doctor doesn't have a phlebotomist waiting for me in the downstairs. He will order labs for me, and I'll go to a lab that's within the network, and they already know what I need because it's all part of the same EHR system. And then he reads the results. So what we try to do is we want to make sure the doctors realize the revenue for that, because a lot of our doctors are paid on a production model. So, you can break it down into, as you know, the diagnostic component, the technical component, interpretation component, it splits it right down the middle. But so we can allow those doctors to refer out for an OCT, but we want the doctor that referred for the OCT to manage that patient. So we want the results to come back to that doctor so they can have the patient back and discuss the results, or have the OCT done a week or two before their scheduled appointment. So, yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the things that I don't think that optometrists realize as an opportunity is we can take advantage of our scale and our capital. I have a very large equipment budget that we manage our repairs and replacements, but we can also buy purchases or buy equipment, excuse me, that again, when you spread the costs out over 10 locations and that patient base, it's a much easier return on investment than one practice that hey, I think I really want to do IPL.
It makes complete sense. That's awesome. Well, I know we could talk for another hour or so, but I hold us to a half hour here. I really appreciate you sharing your perspective on things, and thanks for being part of the show.
No, it's my pleasure. It's good talking to you, and I'm sure I'll see you around at some of our meetings.
Likewise. And thank you for joining us for this episode. Make sure to like and subscribe. Stay tuned for the next episode of The OI Show.